Enforcing a state of emergency in Egypt. The military-backed government says the measures are necessary to fight what it calls a war on terrorism. Thousands have been arrested and detained. But is Egypt returning to the Mubarak era? This is Inside Story. Hello there, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. This week, Egypt's state of emergency was extended for another 2 months. The government says it's for security reasons, but opponents say it will mean more oppression and abuse. According to Amnesty International, some 3,000 people have been arrested since the overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi in July. The organisation has documented several cases where detainees were denied prompt access to their lawyers or families. Around 600 people have since been released, but Amnesty says it's concerned that many were arrested for exercising their right to peaceful protest. Add to that the accounts of terrible prison conditions. Some detainees say they were made to sleep on concrete floors and denied light or human contact. And it's not just Egyptians who are suffering. This week it emerged 2 Canadians who were arrested have gone on hunger strike in protest. And on Tuesday, the French Foreign Ministry confirmed one of its citizens being held in Cairo was beaten to death by other inmates. We've got a lot to discuss. Let me introduce today's guests in London. Nicholas Pierchot, North Africa and Egypt campaigner for Amnesty International. Joining us via Skype from Cairo is Marwa Maziad, a columnist at the Egyptian newspaper Al Masri Al Youm. And here in Doha, we have Mohamed Adel, co-founder of the April 6 movement, an Egyptian activist group. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Nicholas, let me start with you then. Amnesty is reporting that lawyers have been barred from hearings, interrogations are being conducted during curfew hours, and lawyers are not being informed of their clients' whereabouts.
That's absolutely right. What Amnesty International has documented is really a new wave of repression. It's a return to the kind of tactics and abuses that we saw under the 30-year state of emergency that marked Hosni Mubarak's rule. There are so many concerns here, but I think we have to look at the kind of individual cases that we've been documenting as well. One woman protester who was arrested with a broken leg said she spent days asking to be transferred to a hospital before she was given adequate medical treatment. We've documented waves of arrests of Mohamed Morsi supporters. Many of them have been denied their basic legal rights, rights like access to a lawyer, rights like being given access to a judge. Unless the Egyptian authorities take immediate steps to ensure that justice is done, Egyptians' right to justice will be undermined. And I think, just as crucially, Egyptians' right to see justice done will be robbed.
You said there that you think it's what we're seeing in Egypt is a return to the Mubarak era. Is that a realistic description?
Well, I think what we could expect to see are trials of Muslim Brotherhood officials and members. I think the real question is here how fair these trials will be. Under Hosni Mubarak, it was really emergency courts enforced by the state of emergency that sent many leading Muslim Brotherhood officials to jail. We also saw trials by military courts of civilians. I think we're beginning to see these kind of things happening again today. We are seeing new trials of civilians by military courts, including just in the last few days a journalist who has been referred to a military court.
Marwa, let me bring you in here. Do you agree with what Nicholas is saying? Are Egyptian authorities failing to respect people's rights?
I am disagreeing with the point of return to Mubarak's era or any other era for that matter. I think Egyptians are very adamant about the idea of moving forward. I will never disagree with Amnesty International's work of documenting and being delineated about each case, but as a general circumstance, we need to go back a little bit in order to contextualize what a state of emergency is. A state of emergency is when a government declares a suspension of some normality of duties, either in the branches of power or signaling to citizens that there's something that is demanding a certain change in their normal behavior.
But Marwa, if I can just if I can interrupt, Nicholas's point is that this is what Egyptian people lived under for 30 years, and this is what they lived under Mubarak's rule. So now there's another state of emergency. It seems that Egyptian people are barely ever out of a state of emergency.
I don't want to connect the... let me go back again after 2011. We had a revolution that everybody clapped for worldwide. And then a military council came to govern, and everybody was not thinking of that as a ruling junta at the time. Yet that very military council is the one that suspended emergency, state of emergency on March 2011 and ruled without a state of emergency. So the idea is that what necessitated a resurrection of disorder in Egypt following July 3rd and following the snatching of power that ensued from June 30th uprising and demonstrations is what necessitated this kind of disorder that created a new state of emergency. If we look at the situation in Sinai, if we look at the situation in this upper Egyptian village, Delga, where Christians are saying that following Rab'a, the Muslim Brotherhood supporters at the time has been declaring the area theirs, some sort of Islamist emirate of some sort, and calling for tributes. And I diagnose that. I'm an academic, after all. I'm diagnosing that as a competing order of violence. Where is the state that, in very Bavarian terms, has a monopoly over violence, and where is the armed struggle that is not guaranteed by any constitutional right in the political and constitutional culture of Egypt?
Now, the US has renewed calls for Egypt to lift its state of emergency, but Cairo's army-backed government insists it's been necessary in order to stop the violence. The army has been waging daily battles against what it calls Islamist militants in the northern Sinai Peninsula. It says elements in the largely lawless region bordering the Gaza Strip and Israel pose a threat to national security. On Tuesday, Egyptian security forces stormed a town south of Cairo. Groups loyal to deposed President Mohamed Morsi had thrown out the local police force in Dalga in Minya province. They were blamed for looting churches, courthouses, local government buildings and police stations, setting some on fire. Mohamed, if I can come to you, what do you think about this, the justification for having a state of emergency in Egypt that it is a war against Islamist insurgency?
No, it's not war against the Islamists. It's a war against civils at the end. And we are refusing using the emergency of law and political issues. And we see that this emergency law are using to attack another side in the political. If it's Muslim Brotherhood, if it's Islamist. And we refusing that. And refusing that because this is the baddest law in Egypt, using along of Mubarak time and Mubarak regime against all activists and against all civils. So we think that the regime right now in Cairo will use this law again against all of things and all of activists. Today he are using this law against Islamists. Tomorrow he will use it against us and against all civils. Also, there are about 5 of journalists in Egypt are facing a military regime because they just write about what happened in Sinai. Like one of them is Ahmed Abu Drea. So we didn't know that why they're using this law.
But Mohamed, I mean, you can't deny that there is a problem of lawlessness in northern Sinai. We've seen attacks on army personnel, on police buildings. We've seen car bombs and suicide bombs. So what is the government to do? They
must use the basic law, not the emergency law. The using of the emergency law will make many problems in Cairo. We know that the state security just need more permissions to work against civilians in Cairo and in streets. It's not just using against Islamists or against people who they are carrying guns. So what happened in Sinai, it's out of control, and also our without of law. So we asking them to back to law. I didn't understand how one like Adi Mansour, and he at the end he is judge, he are accepting using the emergency law against civilians. What happened in Sinai actually is not war. It's killing people and killing the Sinai people without any reasons.
What do you think of that, Marwa?
Look, emergency situation, and I keep emphasizing it's a state of emergency. If we do just a comparative story, when France declared an emergency situation in November 2005 due to civil internal unrest. That was perfectly legal. The highest administrative body in the Council of State ruled that the 3-month state of emergency decree was legal, despite 74 law professors and Green Party members petitioning against the legality of that situation.
But Marwa, in this instance, in Egypt, what you have is a situation where an elected institution was removed by a military force who then promptly reinstated a state of emergency. There's no comparison with France there.
It's a comparison of the situation. If you're denying that millions of people marched in another uprising to call for early elections, which is a very democratic demand at the time, to which former President Morsi did not respond.
Yes, but they were calling for the removal of a democratically elected president. That's not a democratic demand.
They were calling for early elections, to which there was no response. But we're not discussing, by the way, that incident. This goes down in history, and I think I would like to hear from Mr. Adel from April 6th, whether they supported June 30th. I think they mobilized for it. So following that situation is the unraveling of a situation of disorder, of chaotic a security pathology, given the response from the Muslim Brotherhood in relation to that. I always make the reference to Turkey's Erbakan in 1997, when under similar situation, he was told that he was trespassing on constitutional fundamentals of the state. What did he do? He resigned, saying, I'm a patriot, I'm not going to subject the country to civil unrest. And his people, his supporters went ahead and created the very Justice and Development Party that we praise of Erdogan. So what I'm saying, the political process is unfolding. And I'm not, as I say, discussing June 30th or July 3rd. What I'm discussing is the situation of emergency that is unfolding, which is very different from the kind of emergency situation that rules for 30 years under the single government that Mubarak was. So
okay, what I'm going to do now, sorry to interrupt you, Marwa, is just because we're talking about emergency law, I'm just going to lay out for all our viewers exactly what that means. Now, as we've said, there's hardly been a time when Egypt hasn't been under emergency law since the assassination of President Anwar Sadat in 1981. Now, the measures allow security forces to detain people for any period of time for virtually any reason. They also grant broad powers to restrict public gatherings and media freedom. Lifting the state of emergency was one of the demands of the 2011 uprising. That goal was realised when the extraordinary measures expired in May last year under the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. But emergency law was reintroduced by the elected President Mohamed Morsi in January this year for 30 days to curb renewed unrest. The latest state of emergency was brought back on August the 14th by the interim President Adli Mansour and extended again on Thursday. Nicholas, let me bring you in here. So the argument is that, this is just a part of the political process which is ongoing. It was in response to pressure on the streets for people who wanted to remove President Morsi from power. Is there actually a large proportion of the Egyptian population who are in favour of what the interim government has been doing, are in favour of this crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood?
Look, I can't speak to that, but what I can tell you is that fundamentally the Egyptian authorities don't need more emergency powers to combat the civil unrest that we've seen. What we really need is effective policing. And in response to the current unrest, political violence, attacks on Coptic Christians, what Amnesty International has documented time and time again is the failure of security forces to adequately police unrest and violence. That includes the kind of political violence that we've seen. For example, in a well-known case in Alexandria, when a young man was thrown off a building by Mohamed Morsi's supporters, or in Mansoura, when Mohamed Morsi's supporters were protesting and a number of women protesters were attacked by thugs, the security forces have been nowhere to be seen. They don't need new emergency powers. What we need is a means to make them effective in what they are doing. They need to respond to the kind of wave of violence that we've seen.
I mean, look at the violence
against Coptic Christians.
Well, exactly, and that's one of the factors playing into this. Is it the case that there is an anger towards security forces, towards the military, which is hardening attitudes and maybe making moderate attitudes more radical in their views?
Well, I think, of course, there's a widespread anger at the security forces, and abuses by the security forces really led to the 25th January revolution. The case of Khaled Said, for example, who was beaten to death in Alexandria just before the revolution, he became known as the martyr of the state of emergency because for years torture and abuse by the police went unanswered.
Look,
I think also the problem of
a little bit with this, Shuli, if you allow me. I think I agree very much with what you said about the security situation. Maybe there is no need for security for emergency laws. I don't think we're discussing emergency laws. We're discussing the state of emergency in which Egypt finds itself today, the situation of emergency. Are we in an emergency situation or not? Given the disorder in the security domain, I think it's legitimate to say we are in a state of emergency. I want to go back. I think since I live in Egypt and I take cabs all the time, it was very important to me to ask cab drivers about their sense of treatment with the security forces, especially under the curfew, because as you legitimately mentioned, the case of Khaled Said, or this legacy of cab drivers or microbus drivers being just pushed and shoved around by security forces, maltreated, misrespected, all of that. How much of that is still the experience of especially the lower middle class and the lower classes of male Egyptians?
But Marwa, what Nicholas is saying is, why do you need emergency rules to deal with this kind of civil unrest? Why don't you just have a better police force or a better security force?
Very specific. Actually, then we don't disagree. I'm not saying that these are emergency laws. Nobody's in Parliament writing laws, by the way, right now. It's as specific as declaration of a state of emergency, which necessitates, by the way, even the military presence on the streets, because under normal circumstances...
But how does a state of emergency apply to people who are trying to protest peacefully?
What do you mean?
You're talking about, you've mentioned problems in Sinai and problems in Delga, but what Nicholas is talking about is, ordinary civilians being rounded up and detained because they're trying to make their voices heard, that they're against Morsi being removed from power. Why should a state of emergency apply to them? Why do we need a state of emergency to deal with that?
I've seen demonstrations actually from the Muslim Brotherhood taking place in normal hours. By the way, the curfew itself is being extended till midnight. It had been until 7 p.m. at some point, and that was becoming very frustrating for just normal Egyptians, not just the politically active and protesting, which they have every right to do peacefully. But what I'm saying is that those who were protesting before the curfew and not breaking the curfew that applies to everybody at that time were demonstrating, but they were also cutting roads. And we see live pictures, and I take the streets, and we see Coronation Kneel being blocked.
Mohammed, let me bring you in, because I can see you shaking your head at that. What do you say to that?
I at first, every sex movement, when it supports the sort of June revolution or action, we will not support also. We support it, but it's not meaning that we will support the emergency law or emergency situation. I think that the police in Egypt is very, very bad, and he didn't need to use the emergency law. During Morsi regime, when he used the emergency situation in Port Said and Ismailia and Suez, we said we are refusing that. And if you had some problem in Port Said, it's not meaning that you must start the emergency using the emergency law in this area. So I amazing how some journalists are saying the emergency law is very good, and it's we must using
and I even didn't talk about emergency law. I'm talking about the
emergency situation. Also, emergency situation. As that there are many problems with journalists. As someone called Ahmed Abu Drea, a journalist of Al Masri Al-Yom in Sinai, he arrested because he just filming a film and talking about the pilot and the plane who killed people in Sinai in front of Rafah border. I don't know how the journalists in Cairo saying it's okay for using situation. If people block the road and Coronation Kneel is not using, we must.
Well, let's talk about media freedom, because media freedom, of course, was one of the things that was virtually non-existent under the Mubarak era. Nicholas, there does seem to be an intolerance of journalists, particularly Western journalists, who are not reporting things from a pro-government position. Would you agree?
Look, I mean, I think in the moments after Mohamed Morsi was ousted, the security forces immediately launched raids on television stations which were considered to be sympathetic to him, including Al Jazeera, and their staff were briefly detained. I think since then we've seen a general intolerance of dissent against the authorities. Journalists have been briefly detained and questioned, but there's also been a sort of pervasive shutting down of criticism of the authorities. And that's something that we've seen repeatedly under the rule of Hosni Mubarak in the military, but I think it's also one of Mohamed Morsi's legacies as well. That was something that was symbolic of his administration. It's incredibly disappointing that it seems to be continuing now under these interim times.
You know, Nicholas, I hear that the military leader... Sorry, Marwa, I just wanted to ask Nicholas this, because we're hearing talk that the military leader, the General al-Sisi, who's been, orchestrating a lot of this, is being pushed to stand as president for Egypt. What do you think about that?
I mean, Amnesty International is not a political organization, so we can't comment on whether he'll stand for president or not. But I think there is a pervasive climate where criticism of the authorities' actions is being, either suppressed or shut down.
Right, very briefly to my other two guests, because we are coming to the end of the programme. Of course, the government has laid out a political roadmap which is going to provide for parliamentary and presidential elections in 2014. Do you think that's going to be a way out of this crisis? Marwa, first to you.
Actually, what I was delineating as an academic is the way of the state looking at the pathology of security, and declaration of state of emergency is not within the legal umbrella of what the state can do. Every delineation that you presented as an activist, as April 6th member, and as Amnesty International representative, this is the kind of thing we actually need, and we need it to be voiced not just on Al Jazeera International, but within Egypt.
Okay.
So I don't see that this is a contradiction, rather. But actually an agreement. As for what some people are calling on General Sisi to go through elections or all sorts of things.
Marwa, like I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're coming to the end of the programme. I do want to ask Mohammed's opinion on whether he thinks that the elections scheduled for 2014 is going to be a way out for Egypt.
We think that Sisi will not join the next election, but we see that the people who are supporting Mubarak regime and supporting the military, those people who are talking to Sisi to join, to candidate himself to next election. We will not for him, and we also saying to all people around Egypt that we must mobilize ourselves against the emergency situation, and also against the crimes what happened to the human rights in Egypt. The real activists and the real journalists must not talking and accepting the emergency situation in Egypt, because we see that it's the first step for new dictatorship will happen in Cairo.
Thank you to all my guests today. It was a great discussion, very interesting. Thank you to Nicholas Piershaw, Marwa Maziad and Mohammed Adel. Don't forget, you can find this programme and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Bye for now.